Here, he's been a great supporter of CAC activities over the years, so thank you very much. And we're honored today to have Craig talk about some of his research and his recently published book. The title today is Red Flag in the Heavens, Challenge, Process, and Reward of Publishing a Book about Revolution and First Century Mormons. Craig?
That's it. Thanks very much. Very welcome. So I can't come off, and usually on Fridays or Wednesdays at 4 o'clock, I'm at McCullough Junior High School teaching bagpipe lessons. Because we're trying to get a band going at the high school, and this is kind of my first cadre of 7th and 8th graders. We'll move to the 9th grade campus, then on to the 10th grade. Hopefully by that time, we got some players. Before I get started, I missed class for the first time last Thursday and Friday since 1998 because I had to go to Fort Benning, Georgia to see an old ROTC classmate of mine, David Haig, be promoted to Brigadier General in the U.S. Army. Big event. It was a real achievement. David Haig was was task force commander for some of the most difficult missions the United States was facing in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was infantry. He commanded the 3rd Brigade of the 10th Division in Iraq. That's 3,000 men. And then he did 3 tours. He's got 6 overseas stripes on his sleeves. That's about as much time as if he's overseas during all of World War II. And he also commanded a battalion of the 325th Parachute Infantry on his 2nd tour in the 82nd Airborne. In his speech at Fort Benning, Georgia, and also all of his classmates were there, the ones that went infantry with him. I hadn't seen him for 27 years. And he held up a big key ring full of dog tags. He goes, these men were all killed under my command, 48 of them, 2 of them in an accident. The parachutes collided, intertwined, the domes collapsed, and they fell 300 feet in northern Iraq, and that was that. But it was a great experience. His 2 younger brothers were there. They were freshmen and sophomores when I was a senior. They're colonels in the Army now. And I can't believe it because we used to abuse them in all kinds of ways. And we asked them, is it really true that your older brother, I mean, the minute we met, it was like being back in college, is it really true your older brother used to roll you up in a blanket like this and then stand you up at the top of the stairs of your house and kind of push you down the stairs? He goes, yeah, he would do that. And as he's pushing us, he would whisper in our ear, do you love me? And they'd go, yeah. He goes, not fast enough. He'd just push us right down. So that was a great time. I really needed that. Okay, good. Let me just. What I want to do is I'm gonna end the technicalities of book and reward and challenge of publishing a book on this topic, and I want to open it up kind of to a philosophical debate about revolution, violence, change. The movie Les Miserables, and what conclusions can be drawn about revolution from that. That's kind of a neat thing. And by the way, in my book, I do talk about Victor Hugo. Mormon missionaries met him in 1868, gave him a Book of Mormon 4 years after he wrote Les Miserables, and had some very interesting things to say about him. Okay, this was originally it was my dissertation, Temple University 2002, but the rewrite was so substantial that it virtually qualifies as an entirely new book. It was just huge, the rewrite involved. And the conclusion was that I learned from all that is that dissertations are the start point, not the terminus. PhD is a terminal degree, but does not terminate contributions to knowledge. And I think there's a lot of reward in using your final degree as the beginning of much more that comes beyond. Because my dissertation, I look at it now, we needed a lot of work. This is a much better version. Technical features. The original.
No one is ever impressed with their own thesis.
No, I hope none of these things.
Because they know too much of what went in it.
Maybe we could have a book burning in my dissertation.
I look at mine. I look at some of the stuff of mine and go, man, they passed me on this.
Yeah.
I'm kind of naive.
Yeah. My professor took a chance on me. Yeah. The original manuscript was 601 pages. The new version is down to 450. It's far more condensed and compact. There's over 1,000 footnotes in it, over 12 chapters. You'll see the chapter breakdown on that sheet I gave you. It only has 2 diagrams in the chapter about revolutionary symbolism, but that's offset, and I've always done this in some of my stuff, is to make a very detailed biographical register so that people prominently mentioned We have a biographical sketch about their lives. For example, just to kind of, I have biographical sketches on 43 major, we call Mormon observers who were writing about revolution. I'll get to the book in just a moment. One of them was John Q. Cannon. He was a son of Mormon counselor to John Taylor, who was John Q. Cannon Sr. John Q. Cannon, son of George Q. Cannon, counselor and presiding bishopric, 1884, arrested on charges of polygamy in 1886, a transgression for which he was excommunicated. Rebaptized in 1888, editor-in-chief of Deseret News, which is still Salt Lake's major newspaper. When Spanish-American War began, he was a captain in Torrey's Rough Riders, the second U.S. volunteer cavalry. Roosevelt was the first, but a train accident en route to Tampa prevented deployment to Cuba. Democrat, held several state and business offices, fled to Canada in 1905 after being accused of embezzling funds from the Utah-Louisiana Purchase Fair Commission. Utah's governor did not seek extradition. Editor of the Deseret News from 1918 to 22 and 1928 to 31. So he was just one of the 43 very prominent Mormons. Some were leaders, some were just intellectuals writing about global revolutions.
Polygamy, though, wasn't that just normal for the Mormons?
Say again?
He got arrested for polygamy?
Yeah, but this is when they're after 1890, the manifesto declared no more. We will not contract any more polygamous marriages. Some went to Mexico. Some faced arrest. Eventually, President Grover Cleveland struck a bargain with Mormon leaders in San Francisco and said, if you cease cohabitation with more than one woman, pick a wife, that's your wife. But all of your other marriages are legal and legitimate. Those children can inherit money, they assume your last name, they are wives by the law, but you're to pick one to cohabitate with. And we will not seek any more federal prosecution for violation of the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1888. With that deal, the manifesto was announced, no more polygamous marriage. But it was kind of a long transition before the old guard, and about 20% of Mormons were living in a polygamous relationship. One of them was my great-great-grandfather. He had 3 wives and 36 children, 12 by each one of them. I'm descended through the second one. But there was a lot of, hanky-panky. They didn't totally abandon their wives. I mean, they did still visit them until they finally all died away. Archival sources, it's loaded with books and magazines, primary and secondary. Archival sources include rare documents, diaries, letters, mission records, newspapers, unpublished manuscripts, broadsides and pamphlets, and the LDS Church's journal history, a gigantic, huge file cabinet microfilm of the history of the church in kind of a scrapbook form, an indispensable source for anybody doing Mormon history. The index is being generated right now. It'll take them about 2 weeks. It's being done by a graduate student at the Claremont Graduate School, Ron's alma mater, Chris Smith. It's probably going to come out in hardcover. The dust jacket is my design, and the title is the same title as the dissertation was. They said don't change it. The book is basically about how a century's worth of Mormon observers, as I call them, leaders and intellectuals, writers and whatnot, looked at world revolutions. Are revolutions a good thing or a bad thing? The basic premise is that they tended to view revolutions of the people, bloody, violent upheavals, revolutions of 1848 in Europe, Paris 1871, Russia 1905, Russia 1917, Mexico 1910, anti-colonial revolts in Ireland, India, the Philippines, Cuba, South Africa, labor strikes during the age of industrialization following the Civil War. They viewed with strong favor, which is so unlike the modern arch-conservative Mormon church. They saw that as preparatory to the beginning of the Lord's kingdom, and that once the people had overthrown despotic rulers, Christ from above would consummate the revolution of the people and establish the millennial reign. So Mormonism's first century was very radical in that sense. Now, there were some challenges to that thesis, and I'll explain that in just a moment. My inspiration, D. Michael Quinn. I had classes from at BYU, probably the greatest Mormon historian of my generation. David Montgomery, my master's thesis advisor. Russell Weigley, who's dead now at Temple University. Richard Immerman, who chaired my PhD committee. He was not a religious historian, but he took me on, and I'm very appreciative for the risk he took. And my methods. I did originally everything was manual technique. I had no digitized information at all. I looked through old indexes to find articles in newspapers, the journal history, the LDS Church's Millennial Star that's began published in England starting in 1840 and did not disappear until 1975. A wonderful internal record of the history of the Mormon Church. It was published in Liverpool. Everything had to be done manually. Then came CDs that digitized some things, and finally online, which made, by the time I got to the revision, the online stuff was extremely helpful, and there was plenty of that. I made a lot of chronologies. The book is not a narrative, but I tried to make it a narrative, a story that linked one to the other. So I'm a real strong believer in making chronologies. Challenges. I always knew as a sixth-generation Mormon and as a Mormon historian that the revolutionary imprint was always there. I always suspected that. It had been studied in other ways, that Mormons had pretensions to put Joseph Smith in the presidency. There was the Council of 50 that was going to politicize the Mormon Church, and this Council of 50 would be the government in being ready to assume leadership when Christ returned to the earth. They were thinking politically and very imperial in the 1840s. So it was always there, and I owe gratitude to scholars like Klaus Hansen at University of Toronto and Michael Quinn for their works that really laid the groundwork for me, but nobody had ever looked at their Mormon leadership's ideas about revolutions in general and how they could make their theology fit global events. As they tried to view that Scripture is not the only source of truth, that God was also working in history horizontally, that history was a canon, Scripture itself, and that man was, as an agent of God, was performing God's will. And that alternative source of divine truth they really believed in. And that's why they saw in revolution, or tried to see in revolution, God's will. Despite that, I knew it was there, I still had to try to get my mind back into the 19th century, because we know the Mormon Church today has, Utah's a right-to-work state. Unionism is very weak there. No state in the country is more Republican than the state of Utah. Bill Clinton got fewer votes there by percentage than any other state in the United States. It's a one-party state. The Utah legislature is nearly 80% Mormon. Almost all of her governors, senators, and congressmen are Mormons. It's the only state dominated completely by a religious majority. Rhode Island comes close, but nothing quite like what you find in Utah. So I had to constantly remind myself, I'm talking about the 19th century church, not the 20th century. There was, as I tried to reach for my thesis, I did sometimes overreach, and when we revised the book, we made sure we cut out anything that was maybe inconsequential or maybe the wrong interpretation, or me trying to read too much in it. That's one thing I learned. Come up with one or two good, strong evidences are far safer as far as scholarly integrity than 5 references that might be shaky. Vocabulary. Another challenge in explaining Mormon history was that as a Mormon, you have a vocabulary of what things mean. You know what a Lamanite is. You know what the celestial kingdom is. You know what the priesthood is. You know what a first counselor is, an apostle, a 70, an elder. You have a special meaning of what the millennium is supposed to be. So the Claremont Graduate School editors reminded me, Craig, we might have to stop here. Maybe find another word to explain what you're saying, or stop here and explain what you mean so that a non-Mormon reader will be able to understand exactly what's being said here. And eliminating jargon and a vernacular unique to Mormons was very refreshing for me to recast it and put it into other words. The rewards of all this, first of all, students think it's way cool if you're publishing a book. I mean, they think that's unbelievable. Contributing to knowledge and receiving peer reviews of your work is kind of the pinnacle of scholarly existence. My writing skills have been enhanced dramatically, which means that my teaching of writing skills are enhanced. I face the same challenge as students do, just at a slightly higher level. I think we could all kind of agree with that. And also some very basic things. does this paragraph have a good topic sentence? If it doesn't, I've got to rewrite it. Or after the topic sentence, does the rest of the paragraph hang together? Did I write a paragraph, topic A, it's AAA, it stayed on topic A all the way through, or go A, B, C? And the editor was very good at identifying paragraphs for me that, Craig, you need to rewrite this because you lost it. You lost coherence and cohesion. So overall, it's just a great, great experience. Last thing I'll do is just read a couple samples of some of the paragraph or two of two different chapters of the book that kind of illustrate what they're saying about revolutions. One in 1848 and the other in 1912. The Mexican Revolution and the revolutions in Europe of 1848, and then the Mexican Revolution. And then we'll start a discussion on revolutionary change. I think this will kind of prime the pump. Chapter 2, our eyes turn toward the whole European world. What's it called now? What's that chapter? We shortened all the titles from my dissertation. They said books like short titles. They don't like those big, long titles, colon, and a subtitle. You get rid of all that in a book. Mormon observers of the 1848 revolutions in Europe. Context, 1848, a phenomenon occurred. Europe explodes in revolution. The Chartist movement in England, the Habsburg dynasty is overthrown in Naples, Italy, there's rioting in Berlin. Frederick Wilhelm IV is forced to accept a constitution. France is rising up in rebellion against the Orleanist monarchy and is trying to establish the Second Republic of France following the first one of 1789. There's fighting in Vienna. The only places that were still calm were Russia, and Russia's going to come in and react on this. So while in 1848, Mormons, tens of thousands, are headed west down the Mormon Trail towards Utah. But as news of the revolution breaks, they take one look back at the east, Europe. As Apostle Wilford Woodruff said, all our eyes are on the revolutions in Europe. Maybe before they have to go into exile in the American West, maybe the millennium is coming. One of them, the Eastern States Mission President, was William I. Appleby. He wrote beautiful handwriting in this brilliant blue ink. He wrote 120 pages of manuscript. He hoped it would become the church's official history of the revolutions of 1848. So right here, as he sees all this happening, God, Appleby assumed, was orchestrating the social revolution in Europe. When I see the oppression of the poor and man taking the advantage of his fellow man, he wrote in his journal, I exclaim, surely the Lord is at work among the nations and the kingdoms of the earth to bring about his righteous purchase. His Philadelphia broadside decried laws that favored the rich and chastised rulers and capitalists who robbed the lower classes. Amid his commentary on the bombardment of Vienna, rioting in Prague, and the Polish uprising, Appleby expressed his desire for a social revolution. He admitted in June 1848 that his views were almost utopian. Actually, Appleby's writings differed little from those of the barricade builders, at least one of whom later converted to Mormonism. Guy talked about chapter 4. The class conflict that stimulated Appleby also caught the imagination of several British missionaries. The British Mission Log records an upper-class uproar in response to suspected missionary agitation among the workers. Jean-Jacques believed that the dismemberment of empires, the clashing of social institutions, the overthrow of feudal government systems, and the outbreaks of democratic violence would raise the rotten foundation of men's faith and indifference. Thomas Dunlop Brown hoped for a leveling of society that would rectify everything that had gone wrong in history. Revolutions were destroying the clay and iron feet of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel 2, 24-45. Dethroned kings, violent displacement of the ruling class, and murder of the capitalists was prerequisite to the millennium. Well, they were pretty angry about what's going on. Then came the reaction in 1849. Russian troops marched into Habsburg territory and they restored Habsburg rule in Vienna. They crushed the Polish uprising and smashed the uprising in Prague. A violent reaction. German troops crushed the barricades in Berlin and Frankfurt. Frederick Wilhelm IV became a virtual divine right ruler again. And in France, Napoleon III in 1851 destroyed the Second Republic and established the Second French Empire after his uncle Napoleon. in 1851. Napoleon III will be overthrown in the revolution of 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. So this reaction just stuns Mormon observers. They can't believe it. They thought surely the millennium was about to open. After Napoleon's coup, Elder Curtis Bolton, then translating the Book of Mormon for the first time in French in Paris, walked the bullet-riddled streets of Paris. Inquiries of passersby confirmed for him that France had ceded its revolutionary leadership. At a signal given, the troops leveled and fired. The 33rd Regiment of Infantry seized a mother of children large in the family way. She had several knives in her possession. They stood her out and shot her. French soldiers did that, not Indians. Orson Hyde, who's a Mormon apostle, believed that France had betrayed republicanism. Affairs in France had reached the crisis so long dreaded, but Hyde could not imagine that 12 middle-aged Bonapartists would survive the onslaught of 100 million aroused Frenchmen. The Millennial Star reprinted the words of Eliza Cook, a non-Mormon Chartist poet who agreed with Bolton and Hyde. Cook believed Napoleon III, Nicholas I, and Constitution-promising Frederick of Germany were enemies of progress. She was less sanguine than Hyde, however, about the possibility of an eventual Democratic triumph. The 1846 percussion rifle exemplified for Cook the new weapons the ruling class could turn against the population. Quoting from a British colonial administrator, she detailed the effectiveness of rifled ordnance. Garibaldi's officers in scarlet were regularly shot down without seeing or hearing from which quarter the shot came. On the boulevards of Paris, one of these new balls entered the forehead of a socialist representative the moment he appeared on the barricade with his red flag. In short, disguise it as one may, 500 men so armed are more than a match for 3,000 men armed with the present British musket. Democracy, Cook concluded, was the loser. Okay, so forth and so on. And then finally, the president of the British Mission and editor of the Millennial Star just fell furthest from euphoria. The revolutions had initially humbled the Hohenzollern dynasty, that's Frederick Wilhelm IV, but the spirit of tyranny had returned to the breast of the King of Prussia. He, in partnership with the Holy Quadrangle Alliance, Russia, Austria, Germany, what would become Germany, was enforcing the absolutism present on the whole continent of Europe. Only death promised relief from the people's hell on earth. They were very upset about the reaction of 1849. All right, then the Mexican Revolution, we'll just read just one or two paragraphs here. We have two major Mormon observers. One was, both of them spoke beautiful Spanish. One was the stake president, that's like a diocese in Mormonism, for the Mormon colonies in Mexico. There were thousands living down there. Ray Pratt was the Mexican mission president. He looked very Mexican too. He was very swarthy looking. He mixed with the population really well. They were both in Mexico when the revolution broke out in 1910. Many of Pratt's observations from this period were recorded in a chronicle he kept between February and August 1913, a little pocket diary. The manuscript reveals a man even more class-conscious than his public writings and speeches suggest. Pratt indicted the rich, the Catholic Church, and the Army for being in league against the poor. With historical dialecticism on his mind, he understood the motive force of class struggle in a way that might have pleased Mao Zedong. When the poor native comes to a point to sufficiently note his own interests, then will come the redemption of the native land. The time is ripe for that class that has been held down to rise and be on top. Pratt glowed as Pancho Villa slugged his way towards Mexico City. After the division of the North mauled Huerta at the Battle of Zacatecas, 23 June 1914, Pratt wrote, "Who can doubt that out of the present struggle will grow a great and better Mexico, with an absolute liberty based on human rights for all her people, and the way be prepared for the teaching of the true gospel unto the people and their redemption." Good one here. Other church leaders followed Pratt's lead. In a speech to the Associated Collegians of Brigham Young University, Charles McClellan, formerly a counselor in the Juarez Mexican State Presidency, registered his preference for gradual change. But given that Madero, who was executed, shot by Huerta, the great idealist apostle, was butchered when he tried to change slowly. The Mexican people must be pardoned for relying on the power that a 30-30 rifle gives them. Then McClellan came to the point. It is not a question of this man or that in Mexico. It is a question of principles, of human rights, and you and I, under the same circumstances, would take up our arms. Our fathers did for even less provocation in the days of Bunker Hill, and we honor them for it. In Mexico, McClellan argued, class revolt would weaken the old order. Once accomplished, Mexico must develop a national spirit and receive training in constitutional government to overcome Cien de Fuego and Hacendado influence, class division, and the ethnic differences that would hinder further development. Then in the Holy of Holies in the Salt Lake City Temple, the 12 apostles are meeting, and Anthony Ivins, talking to the other apostles, who are very familiar with what's going on, refers to the Book of Mormon, 3rd Nephi. The Mexican people, Ivins averred, having been trodden down by the Gentiles, will become like a lion among a flock of sheep, so plainly set forth by the Savior himself. The trope of peasant and workers embodied as lions united in a flailing fight to eradicate their overlords marks another step in the reinvention of Ivins. I talk a lot about him. At a chapel dedication in San Diego, he concluded that liberty would be established in Mexico, but only after the conflict that pitted servants against pitiless masters had been won. So that's the kind of language they're using well up until the late 1930s, when the Stalinist purges showed them Russia's not the future, and fascism definitely not the way. They were very depressed by what was going on in the Spanish Civil War, and that vision of revolutionary change slowly constricted. The old guard died, and by World War II, revolution now meant communist revolution and the power of Russia, and they flee away from any belief that revolution was a path to change. So I close at 1940, the beginning of World War I. So that's just an example of what they were. Who's seen Les Miserables? Yeah, the new one out. Whether you've seen the stage version. Let me. Does anybody have any questions?
Is there a particular leader or person in this who you would say stands out as one of the greatest Mormon leaders? Yeah,
who wrote most consistently or vociferously or enthusiastic about the idea of revolution. If I was to look at leaders, say high-ranking presidents or apostles, what we call general authorities of the Mormon Church, the apostle that was most enthusiastic was Wilford Woodruff, and he would later become the 4th president of the church when John Taylor died in 1886. John Taylor was badly wounded in the attack that killed Joseph Smith and his brother in 1844, and was really, didn't really like the Gentile, what they call the Gentile rule very much. He, in his diary, which has been published, he was a copious diarist. In 1848, he was constantly, every dispatch he could read coming from a packet steamer, he is writing about it. He's second to William Appleby, the one with the blue handwriting, in chronicling the revolutions of 1848. So Wilford Woodruff definitely emerges as a revolutionary enthusiast, a quintessential example of God's will being played out on the stage of history until the final consummation from above. In the 20th century, the surprise revolutionist for me was Mormon apostle Melvin Ballard. His grandson is a Mormon apostle now. He emerged suddenly in the year 1930 and 31 when revolutions struck Peru, Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. And he began giving conference speeches. This happened 2 times a year in Salt Lake City, and writing in the Improvement Era, one of the church's organs, that we must stand by the fires of liberty being lit in South America. This will help advance the Indians. Indians are very special in Mormon theology because they're believed to be the tribe of Manassas, one of the lost tribes, who had become darkened by their fall from God's true ways, and the Indians would be the redeemers of the Americas and be founders of Zion and help build God's kingdom. So they have kind of a special place. And because South America had so much Indian blood in it, they saw in revolution the redemption of the Lamanites, Indians from their fallen state. So he was very, very enthusiastic in writing and in speeches. And he also wrote a lot about the Spanish Civil War. And you can tell it's just, as he sees the world just descending into fascist oppression, you can just see his spirit sinking, when none of it, instead, all South America really got was just a regime change. There was no fundamental reforms to society. Only Mexico really had any meaningful revolution between 1824 and World War II. So Ballard in the modern time, and he died in 1939. He didn't even live to see World War II. He's the last one of them really to go. He dies in 1939. And Wilford Woodruff are the most sustained revolutionist and the surprise revolutionist.
Craig, any other religion looked at this revolution as the end of the world, as the
I compare a lot of Mormon thought with what other Americans were saying. There's good compendiums out there about how Americans viewed the Russian Revolution of 1905 and 1917, or American reaction to the German Revolution in 1848. Sometimes they were side by side, but usually with that millennial fervor. The Mormons at this time are premillennialists, that the world is getting worse, and then Christ will fix everything from above. A post-millennialist believe the world is getting better. Missionaries going into the world, steam presses printing more Bibles. Christianity's going to win in profane time. And what's going to merge into the millennium, and then Christ will return and receive the kingdom made by his followers. And so usually because of that, it's that urgency of the message. It separates pre- and post-millennialism. Usually Mormon opinion will start to outdistance and diverge mainstream American opinion, including the Protestant churches, on almost every single revolution. In Latin America in particular, because of the unique role of the Indian as a lost tribe of Israel, of Israelitish blood, the promised people, any revolution in Latin America grabbed Mormon attention in a particular kind of way. Protestant religions also believe that, yes, a regime change in Mexico would liberalize the government and permit freer proselytizing. But as far as the destiny of the Indian and the nation of Mexico, Mormons tended to go a little bit further with that. So sometimes in step and parallel to contemporary American religious and political opinion, and at other times diverging from it or separating. And one of the challenges I faced is that at home, Mormon leaders are becoming very skilled capitalists. The church has huge investments. It's becoming a very wealthy mainstream church. It's been seeking American acceptability. It's leaving behind its radical roots. So how could they then be so enthusiastic about revolutions abroad? What I kind of concluded is that even though they are becoming absorbed and converted into the mainstream as we head into the 20th century, that implosion of American radicalism blew embers out all over the world. And by proxy, in fact, the further away from America the revolution is, the more enthusiastic Mormon writers are, because it's not going to affect their interest directly. But in the revolutions of other people, by proxy, far away from America, the land of liberty, there they believe God was working his will to make the rest of the world open for the missionaries, preparatory to the conversion of the world and eventually the return of Christ in the millennial kingdom. The further away it was, the more excited they were. But they were by the year 1890, they are condemning socialism, because it was without God, and also in a peculiar way because socialism was a very close cousin to Mormon communalism of the 19th century, and it could be a rival in capturing the hearts and minds of the people. So Mormon leaders were going over the top to show how socialism is very different from God's communal laws under priesthood authority, because they realize that socialism has a fundamental appeal to it, getting rid of the individual acquisitiveness to join together as brothers and neighbors, has an attraction that socialism preached. So Mormons tried to separate their version of it from the secular version of it. They feared it as a cousin.
Well, can you elaborate on that? How did they do that? Because I compare this with the flow of communism in Iran when in order to scare Iranians, to my knowledge, from communism, they could not say, hey, the communists come and get your money, because they didn't have money.
Right.
They're going to depress you. Well, they were already depressed.
Right.
So the only thing they could tell Iranians to scare them from the communism, these are godless, and they're going to come and put your sisters and your mother to prostitution.
Right.
How did the Mormons dealt with this socialism?
Well, when I looked at the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, there were some mixed reviews. Now, because it was in the midst of World War I, the toppling of the Tsar was viewed as a movement towards democracy, which made it a lot easier to form a rationale for an American intervention to make the world safe for democracy. It was an unstable alliance where you've got the two liberal and democratic powers of Western Europe, the constitutional monarchy of England and the Republic of France, allied with the most backward medieval autocratic country of all, Russia. And Wilson saying, we're going to make this a world safe for democracy, yet we're going to enter on an allied side that includes Nicholas II and the Russian army. So when the Tsar is overthrown by Alexander Kerensky, at first they saw, that's great, that solves the problem. Now Russia is an emerging democracy, and it was easier to form a rationale for an American intervention. When the Bolsheviks seized power in the Red Revolution of the following November 1917, there were mixed reviews. You had some who believed maybe this is the apocalypse. Maybe this is it. Not just a regime change in Russia, but a complete social overturn. There were others, though, who were very fearful of what was going on in Russia. The word communism had been known and believed that Russia was going to leave the war, abandon the Allies, and so there was more of a military concern. But during the 1920s, most Mormon writers had great faith in Russia, surprisingly. In fact, the president of BYU, Arthur Harris, was an agricultural expert in the Department of Agriculture, hired by the government to go to Russia and see what they're doing and come back with a report. And like a lot of other intellectuals that visited Russia, hoping that there, after the disappointment of World War I, and the U.S. is not in the League of Nations, and there was vindictive anger against Germany, maybe in Russia, the new world is being played out. And they were shown the Potemkin villages, the happy peasants, and they believed it all. They didn't question anything. The will to want to believe that their history is restarting on a collectivist model was so compelling. And Richard Hollander wrote a great book about this. Intellectuals, pilgrims abroad in Europe, wanting to see Russia doing good things. And he came back and reported in the Church's Improvement Era magazine, great things are going on in Russia. They're doing everything wonderfully. It was not until the Stalinist purges of 1934-36, the show trials, that they realized that what's happening in Russia is a new, more awesome state apparatus of power than anything known to the Tsars. Russia was not where the future was being created. But it died hard, as it did in the American intellectual community. It died just as hard among Mormons as well. But by after World War II, Mormons are caught up very much in the anti-communist hysteria. As Russia now didn't mean utopia and brave new world. It was Comintern, Kremlin, KGB, Red Army, and global domination. Yeah. So, but once again, Russia's far away though. They could play out their liking of it because they weren't in the United States threatening to take their money or expropriate their properties or anything like that. So it was by proxy. They could experience Russia by proxy. Mormon editors, BYU, they wrote very glowingly. Even Melvin Ballard, the same one I did the Surprise Revolutionary, he was in charge of the church's welfare system. Utah was very hard hit by the Great Depression, as was a lot of the other Rocky Mountain states. And he thought that Russia, as kind of a welfare state, was an admirable model. He had no condemnation of it at all. But he lived long enough to know about the Stalin purges, died a few years later. By that time, he had completely lost his faith in any kind of revolutionary reform. In the movie Les Miserables, we talk about change and violence. Is Les Miserables a movie that lionizes revolution, or something other?
I haven't watched the movie.
I'm kind of confused on that. Does it praise revolution, the revolutionary model, or is it in the end somewhat? Does it reject revolution? If you think of the songs, think how it ends, think of its most inspiring moment or its saddest moments.
It changes. throughout. Starts up one way, ends up the other.
I think Victor Hugo was trying to say there was something that transcends revolution, that the relationship between Jean Valjean and the love or the Christianity that he showed people was even more important than the revolution.
Yeah, yeah. And the song Empty Tables. Where's all my friends? We were talking big, but what happened? They were wiped out. Yet it's most inspiring moments, on the barricades, the blood of the martyrs, the water of the meadows of France. I mean, it's really, it really gets up there. But yeah, I kind of think that as glorious and as promising the revolutionary model is, there's a transcendent relationship,
Well,
a transcendent
basically,
ideal.
the question is the triumph of the personal, the romantic over the revolutionary, actually a retarding of genuine revolution.
Mhm.
That is, placing feeling over the actual changes that a revolution can affect in people's lives.
Mhm.
Isn't that a falling back into a conservatism?
Right, yeah.
And that's, although that's typically, I think, the argument of the early Stalinists, that we must purge the personal from the revolution. And your music is too personal,
Yeah.
Probably
Well-
Shostakovich had and others,
And there's a dialogue in Les Miserables where, who's the one that's in love with the girl? I forget his name, but kind of the story goes, you have to make a decision. You rise with the people and join us, or go with the girl. But you've got to make a choice.
Yeah, it's an either or.
Yeah.
Or is it? I mean, that's
Jean Valjean goes to the barricade not to participate in the revolution, but to save his daughter's lover.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. From sure death on the barricades. And yet, the closing song, it's the tune, do you hear the people sing, but it's, it'll not be the blood of the martyrs or water of the meadows of France, but it'll be, we will walk in the light of the Lord. It's the same song, but now it turns the cube around and spiritualizes this transcendent idea, man and God, man loving other human beings, rather than establishing a republic in France in the name of the people.
Humanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the words of the last song are very telling. Most people don't listen to it that closely, but yeah, it talks about beating their swords and plowshares.
Yeah, yeah.
And walking hand in hand as brothers.
Yeah.
It's not a revolutionary song.
It's not a revolution, yeah. It's almost like a ballad, a romantic ballad, a church ballad in a way, a religious one. On that topic, is tradition anti-progressive? Is revolution progressive?
I think for this one's instance, like you're talking about Mormon embrace with revolution, it's like when you have this upheaval and everything becomes just drastic. It's a message that a lot of people will receive as far as like,
Yeah.
so it's a good time for them to come in and say, this is who we are, this is what we do, and so it's well received. And so it's a good tactic as well as maybe just a feel, how they believe.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Would you say that all revolutions are really at base theological?
That's a really good point. I do have, in my introduction, I do talk a lot about that. You could go to the Anabaptist revolt in Munster in 1452, where John of Leyden, in what is now Holland, proclaimed the millennial kingdom of God. He anointed 12 apostles. They were even practicing spiritual wifery. They thought God's kingdom had come. Imperial forces wiped them out. But it was an early example of a theologically driven vision of a secular kingdom right here on earth to be established and receive Christ. In fact, D. Michael Quinn, one of the scholars I rely on heavily, wrote a very good article about that, about the Anabaptist Munster revolt in 1452, and it's and he made a interesting tie to certain beliefs of early Mormonism.
What I'm getting at though is, like that, this whole notion that socialism is just warmed over Christianity, that whole idea that any revolution depends upon some understanding of the absolute. It's just a matter of where those leading it position the absolute, whether it's in the next life, this life, in the people, in the heart, in the individual, but it's got to be positioned someplace where there's no direction to the revolution.
Yeah, and in the Western thought, history occurs linearly. We go from a condition that is maybe good now to better to perfect. And in that sense, the Christian dialectic of the millennium, the overthrow of wickedness and the establishment of 1,000 years of peace is very similar. And they've talked about it, but that Karl Marx is a secular version of the same thing, but it'll be a revolution from below. The people will overthrow the ruling class and establish a proletarian worker state of utter perfection where there are no more privately owned machines to exploit the people. It was very linear, very Western in that sense, and was a secular, it was really virtually a secular religion. Faith in the triumph of the working class helped along by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah.
What are some of the commentators saying these days about, I was reading something today that says that, gun sales in the United States have just exploded right now. The people are arming themselves. And so, arming themselves against Obamaism, and sweeping down and being able to shoot down government drones that fly over American citizens, Is this a beginning of a revolution to come?
Without artillery, you can't do much. And all artillery is made by the government at the Rock Island plant in Illinois. 105, 155, and 8-inch guns are all made there. So without our good artillery, you probably can't have a real revolution. You need real heavy weapons to make something like that work. Guns by itself wouldn't do anything. I could bring in one Army battalion into Montgomery County with their weapons. There isn't anything here that would match it. It'd be a blow away. I mean, some really powerful stuff. So, no, I don't. I think it's more symbolic than anything that could even pretend to be real.
So when is Obama going to roll the tanks down the street then?
Yeah. So first it'd have to be a provocation of some kind. But that hasn't, when's the last time that's happened in the United States? The army used against its own people.
You don't
Strike-breaking
control the masses
activity.
by rolling tanks down the streets anymore. You do it by giving government handouts.
Yeah, that's probably, a policy of co-option rather than repression. Yeah.
Let me ask, Craig, in your view, do successful revolutions begin from above and go below and then end up back above? Or is there another pattern?
The normal pattern was that a rise of the peoples was preamble to the destruction of empires and kings, to establish republics that would liberalize. In 1848, they were thrilled by places like Italy and Germany emancipating the Jews.
I'm thinking of the American Revolution.
Oh, the American Revolution.
I mean, the common notion is that it's all about people being upset about excessive taxes and so forth. But it's really wealthy landowners and an elite that is leading it. Then it goes down, and then it comes back up. I mean, at least that's what I'm asking.
Well, okay, yeah. I think in American history, we've got a fork in our revolutionary heritage. One of them follows Thomas Jefferson. He saw the fall of the Bastille. He saw that mob rip apart the Swiss guards and put their heads on a pike and march around. He puts his hand on his friend, fear not the anger of the people. This is what progress is. It'll overthrow the ancient regime and establish a republic sister to the United States. So that's the more radical revolutionary heritage. John Adams, equally important in the founding of the nation, said, Americans lucked out. our revolution didn't eat its own leaders like the French Revolution did. In the American Revolution, those who led it are become presidents of the new republic. In the French Revolution, those who started it end up under the guillotine themselves. Then that group ended up under the guillotine. Then finally, 10 years later, they got Napoleon. They ended up right where they started from, a despotic ruler. So therefore, revolution. In the John Adams revolution, we were lucky. But if they click into a social revolution, in the John Adams, we like revolutions that overthrow kings and liberalize trade and make society more open. But the minute a revolution threatens to go red, expropriating machinery and factories or giving land back to peasants, those are the revolutions we kind of like to squash and not go that direction because of its threats to property and due process and reform. So the American Revolution, I think the founding fathers, in the concept of American exceptionalism, America is a unique, special place that pulled it off just right because it's specially favored by God, and as long as we obey God, God will bless this land. Our revolution, a liberty-centered revolution, did work, but Adams warned against further revolutions of the future. They tend to boomerang and cause more damage than they do good. So I think Americans are kind of split between those two revolutionary heritages.
Craig, I have kind of a question, a follow-up question. The question is, was the embrace of revolution among the Mormons just a few Mormons, or was this the general Mormon attitude? And if it was the general Mormon attitude, how is it that a revolutionary church becomes probably the most conservative church in the history of Christianity?
There's a good book out written by Armin Moss called The Angel and the Beehive. And it's the story of Mormon assimilation into mainstream America. From this despised sect, going from a time where it was okay to blow the brains out of Mormon kids in a Missouri barn at one time in the Mormon War of 1838, into a church where they were respected capitalists. They are senators on Capitol Hill. They have adopted fully American mainstream values, have eliminated any pretensions to separatism from the United States or empire building. They do their service in the military. Is a very, very interesting story. Some have argued the other side of the coin to millennial revolutionism is the fact that Mormons, the early converts, a lot of them never forgot that at heart they're Yankees. They don't like property collectivization, which explains the failure of the Mormon experiments of the 1830s. They have a very strong sense of individualism and Republican values. Individualism, opportunity for the individual. We are independent of prophets and popes and kings to make our decisions for us. All we need is a removal of barriers to going as far as our talent will take you. There was, in fact, Kenneth Wynne wrote a great book about early Mormonism and early Republican values, and that was also a very strong streak among its earliest converts. So I think deep down in the Mormon heart, there had always been a strong respect for the American Constitution, for American heritage. They were very bitter that the country had treated them so bad, which is why during the Civil War, well, they just loved that. They saw that as God's wrath on the American nation for mistreating them and driving them out to the West. When Lee and Johnson surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Brigham Young thunders from the pulpit. Lee and Johnson have surrendered, but the God Almighty has not. He vows the Mormons are going to continue their separatist state. The South was reincorporated in 1865. Mormons held out until 1890 before they made their final compensation their final accommodation with the government. It got so bad that under the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1888, all Mormon church property would escheat to the federal government. They would be stripped of the right to vote. Anybody in polygamy would be thrown into jail. The church was going to be completely disincorporated. That's when Wilford Woodruff decided we need to change. We've got to find a way to accommodate to the American mainstream. And it happened very quickly. Within 6 years, it was the 45th state of the Union, and that's what they got instead of the millennial kingdom of God. And the assimilation process really began. At heart, there was always a strong affinity to America, and most Mormon converts were British, with a strong respect for law and order and progress, and even, shall we say, even imperial institutions on the part of British converts. So that was always right there in them. And the discipline to establish their kingdom out in the West, was those attributes of kingdom building were easily transferable to being a good capitalist as well. And it made a very nice transition. So I'd say that by 1930, the process of assimilation is largely complete. There's still the garden variety of anti-Mormon bias, so that you're still practicing polygamy, or you don't believe in the same Jesus I do, things like that. But by and large, by 1930, the overtly radical elements of Mormonism are gone. My story plays it out. It's an intellectual history. It's a window through which we can see what Mormonism's early original imprint was: a revolutionary, premillennial sect that thought Christ was going to come in the first generation of Mormons being converted. And that urgency gave it a real potent edge, and it was given added force by the fact they had a scripture to go along with it, a new scripture, the Book of Mormon, that would be a second testament to Christ and the prophecies in the Bible. So it was very potent. They kept getting disappointed, but as all millennialists do, they just hit the reset button and they start again. But by the 1930s, that was no longer a profitable exercise. There were more benefits to be mainstream, and they found other ways to distinguish themselves. The word of wisdom: we don't drink coffee, tea, or use tobacco. So certain dietary laws would then separate them, instead of communalism or millennialism or pretensions to an empire in the Rocky Mountains. They would find other ways to distinguish themselves as God's people without the radicalism that had marked their first at least 50 years, at least until the Manifesto of 1890. So it just shows the burning embers of its original millennial theology being played out as they anxiously sought for the original imprint to play out, but as long as it wasn't in the United States, everywhere else in the world. Yeah. How much were rank and file Mormons influenced by it? Well, the writings are so prominent in church periodicals, the Millennial Star in England, and Improvement here in the United States, and in conference talks where the general authorities speak to the church twice every year. It's just rather matter-of-factly talked about. When I looked at editorials in the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News, the editorials written by citizens, I used some of them to show that probably a lot of Mormons just accepted these ideas as well. When they look at the Mexican Revolution and other things like that, they were in line with what a lot of the general authorities and the editors of the church publications are saying. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.